Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another Wednesday session for PPA 660 Organization Theory. I hope you're having a good week. We are progressing very quickly through our class, as we always do with these 6-week DL courses. And so before you know it, we are going to be done. What we have been doing, obviously, over the past few weeks is we have been working our way through chronologically the organization theory literature. Last week, we made our way through some of those neoclassical theories, the human relation school, the school of human resource management. And tonight, what we're going to spend most of our time talking about, at least in the first part of class, is the school of systems theory. And systems theory is something was presented to you in 500. You've probably run into it in some other venues in your time here in the DLMPA program. But what we're going to do tonight is we're going to put a little bit finer point on some of the things we talked about in 500 with systems theory and talk about how systems theory really opened up and expanded our view of how we study organizations by having us look not just at the organization itself, but also looking at the external environment. But before we get to that, I have looked at your last Canvas essays, Canvas essay number 2. Those have all been reviewed and all been graded. So thank you for that. I think the comparisons were very much appropriate and made a great deal of sense for all your organizations that you selected. Then for your next Canvas essay, we're going to reach back to some of the information that we covered when we talked about classic organization theory, and you'll be looking at your organization and pulling out a couple of main examples of Weberian thought, as well as a couple of main examples of Taylor and scientific management that you see embodied within your organizations. And so that will be your next Canvas essay, as always, then due by midnight next Monday. So where we are going from here, because again, this class is going to wrap up very, very quickly on us, so we don't want to be caught sleeping, but where we're going from here is tonight we're going to do systems theory. We do have a breakout room assignment that we're going to do that shouldn't take us terribly long at all. Then we'll assess our time situation. If we have time remaining in the class tonight, then we might work ahead a little bit and look at some more modern theories and start with a discussion of motivational theories. That's only if we have time, because there's a lot of meat, if you will, in motivation theory. We've got a few decades of motivation theory, and so there's a whole lot of substance there. And I don't want to shortchange it, but if we do have ample time, it might not be a bad idea to kind of work ahead and talk a bit in the last part of class about motivation theory. But we'll play it by ear and see how we do. Then next week on May 21st, when we get back together again, we will finish up our discussion of the chronological development of organization theory. We'll talk about some more modern theories, organization culture. We'll talk about participative management. We'll talk about leadership theories. Do all that in the first part of class. And then the second part of class, Morgan is going to do his presentation next week. And if there's anyone else who would like to present next week, I do encourage you to think about that, because if we can get maybe 4 or 5 presentations in the second half of class next week, then that really helps us clear the decks then on May 28th, so that we can be sure that we'll have ample time to get through all of our presentations. Now, remember, these presentations are very informal. They're less than 10 minutes, and so I will have a timer going on my phone to make sure that we don't go past the 10 minutes. So very short, very informal presentations where you just tell us about the highlights of your organizational analysis. And so some of those examples of the classical theory, some of those examples of neoclassical theory, some examples of what type of system the organization operates with, the types of methods of motivating employees and mechanisms of control and models of organizational effectiveness that you've seen in your organizations. So just a very kind of high level 10-minute overview of your organizational analysis. And we'll, again, if we could get maybe 4 or 5 of those done the second half of class next week, that would be wonderful. If you do want to do your presentation next week, just send me an email and let me know that. And then I'll do a first come, first serve type of basis. And so the first folks that contact me will be the ones that get the slots to do it next week. Like I think I told you before, then when we do these presentations, I will just set up the session to enable screen sharing so that if you have PowerPoint slides that you want to share as part of your presentation, you'll be able to just share those yourself. You don't have to rely upon me to share them out. It just seems to make the evening run a little bit smoother and make our presentations go by. And so we don't really go past that 10-minute limit for each one of our presentations. If we're able to get all that done on May 28th, and then we'll be able to wrap up the class, and then all you'll then be doing for May 31st is just putting the finishing touches on your final assessment and your organizational analysis paper to submit by midnight then on May 31st. So in terms of housekeeping, that's kind of where we are and where we are going in the class. Again, tonight, what I'd like to do is spend our first part of the class talking about the School of Systems Theory, talking about natural systems theory, open systems theory, and kind of talk about a segue in which we can move from natural systems theory into open systems theory and kind of show you this chronological development. So with natural systems, we're talking about people like Chester Barnard. We're talking about 1940s, 1950s, when this approach to understanding organizations as part of a system really started to percolate and really started to pick up some steam. Then we get into the 1960s and the 70s, and we see this transition into open systems theory. And I think open systems theory is really very much with us today. And there are a lot of truisms in open systems theory that apply very well to our modern day organizations. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get into our discussion of the School of Systems Theory and how it affects the way in which we study public and nonprofit organizations. So systems theory is very much this holistic view of the organization, this view of the organization as part of something bigger, that it's part of a whole. And if you want to study an organization, you need to understand what part that organization plays in this larger framework of a system. Systems theory, whether it's natural or open systems theory, really does carry with it very much of a rational type of perspective, in that we see organizations as an instrument for helping us achieve societal goals. So organizations exist to help us achieve societal goals, so they have a role to play in a larger type of societal approach. But it's a very holistic type of what part does the organization play within the entire environment. So in terms of natural systems perspective, the natural systems theorists such as Chester Barnard and others view organizations as being akin to these living organisms. So just like any other living organism, all living organisms from the time that they are born, from the time they are created, their primary goal is to try and survive into the future. In order to survive into the future, they need to become adaptive to their environment. For natural systems theorists, they are really looking at what's going on within the organization, the internal environment of the organization, and how we can modify that internal environment to help promote agency survival. So the ultimate goal of an organization, according to these natural systems theorists, is to keep the organization going and get the organization to survive as long as it can. The problem, though, is when you view an organization as a living organism. All living organisms will go through a process of deterioration and decay. There is a lifespan that every living organism has. And as living organisms age, they tend to go through this maturation process where they tend to lose energies and resources out into their external environment. This is a process that natural systems theorists refer to as entropy. So through the entropy process, they dissipate energy and they dissipate resources into the external environment. So what types of resources can they lose and dissipate into the external environment? Obviously, money, organizations that lose appropriations. That loss of appropriations can obviously lead to an end to that organization because, as Norton Long tells us, money is the lifeblood of organizations. They could lose, grant funds in terms of money. If they start losing their donors, It's going to be very difficult for those nonprofit organizations to survive. Employees, personnel, you can dissipate those types of energies and resources as well. If you're losing your personnel and you have very high turnover rates, and one of the problems that most people point out with organizations is that the organizations tend to have high turnover rates. I think I shared with you that our college here at Cal State Long Beach has such high turnover rates that we now have a 46% vacancy rate among staff members in the College of Health and Human Services. That's a problem. And that's a problem on many different levels. We won't get into what all those problems are here tonight. But as you lose those individuals, you have a brain drain. You lose institutional memory. You have to then put more resources into recruiting and onboarding new employees. So losing personnel, that could be another resource that you can lose. Losing constituent support, losing political support for your organization, those are other energies that you can dissipate, you can lose into your external environment. One of my favorite examples of that is an organization that was created back in 1935 as a result of the New Deal. I may have mentioned to you before, the Rural Electrification Administration, or the REA. The REA was one of those New Deal agencies that was created to try and address the problems associated with the Great Depression. The mission of the Rural Electrification Administration was a very simple and very straightforward one: to bring electrical service to rural areas, specifically to farms in those rural areas. So electrification, that was their primary goal. The way in which they would do it is they were charged with giving out federal loans to farmers and to communities so that those farmers and communities could take that money and they could use it to create these electrical cooperatives. So they would create their own electrical co-ops, and that would then provide the infrastructure for them to then electrify their farms. So it was a pretty simple mission. It was also a pretty simple program that was in place to help the agency accomplish that mission. So they were created in 1935. When they were created, fewer than 30% of farms had electrical service. So there is certainly a need for this organization. The more the perceived need for the organization, the higher the likelihood the organization is going to survive. However, by the late 1950s, practically every single farm, even in the most rural areas, already had created these electrical cooperatives and already had electrified their farms. And so the mission was basically met by the late 1950s. The REA then started to adopt the missions of some other organizations and started doing other things beyond their primary mission of electrification. And they did that for the primary purpose of trying to promote agency survival. Eventually, by 1994, the REA was finally disbanded. And what the REA was still doing, all those functions were then consolidated within the Department of Agriculture and within a unit in the Department of Agriculture known as the RUS, I think it was called. And it was the Rural Utility Service, I believe is what it was called. And so it went out of existence in 1994. Should it have probably gone out of existence earlier than that? Probably. But this is a great example of how an organization, once it has met its mission, it can try and hang on for a while, but eventually they're going to lose political support. They're going to lose constituent support because they really don't have those constituents anymore. Those constituents are no longer interested in the organization continuing if they have already created their electrical co-ops. When I was teaching at Eastern Illinois, my last year there, I got the great idea that I'm going to move out of Charleston, which was the college town, and I'm going to move to a more rural area. And so I moved about 30 minutes, 45 minutes away down south to a city. Well, at that time, I think it was technically a city at that time, but it was called Toledo, Illinois. Not Toledo, Ohio, Toledo, Illinois. You drive into the town, and it's famous for having a sign as you drive into the town. And when I lived there, the sign said, "Welcome to Toledo, Illinois, the home of 687 happy souls and 13 sourheads." And that was their sign as you drove into the town. I Didn't figure out who those 13 sour heads were in the year that I lived there, but it was a very rural community. We had a county courthouse. We had an IGA grocery store. We had a post office, and we had a tractor parts supply company. That was it in the entire town square. There was not a traffic light. There was one yield sign. As you come into the square, we didn't even have a stop sign. We only had yield signs. And so a very, very small area. The house that I moved into was surrounded on three sides by cornfields, not regular cornfields, feed cornfields. And so fields that were growing corn, feed corn that was used for livestock and everything that was what surrounded the entire house. We lived off of a county road. We were part of the electrical co-op for the farms that surrounded the house. That's just kind of the way in which it works. So we were reliant upon that electrical co-op for our electrical services. That electrical co-op was originally funded with federal loans from the Rural Electrification Administration. So I kind of have that connection to the REA. But it's a great example of once your mission is met, then you don't have the same constituent and political support to continue, and you lose those types of energies out into the environment, and it becomes much more likely that you will go out of existence. These organizations that as they age, because they are dissipating energy and resources into their environment, they can kind of see the handwriting on the wall, which means if you cannot abate the loss of those energy and those resources, you're probably going to go out of existence. So what a lot of those older organizations will do is they'll start building walls and they'll become very institutionally rigid. And there's this theory in public administration known as the theory of institutional rigidity. As organizations get older, they have more rules, more regulations, and they place these walls between themselves and the external environment so they can conserve whatever energies and resources they have left within the organization. Once we have older organizations doing that for the purpose of agency survival, that institutional rigidity will then create what we call a closed system. So their system becomes very closed. They're only really interested in the internal processes that are going on within the organization, and they don't really pay a lot of attention to the external environment. They make it more difficult for people from the external environment to interact with the organization because of all these rules and these regulations that they have established. Once they create this closed system and put these barriers up between themselves and the public, then members of the public become very dissatisfied with these organizations. This is where you get all the cliches about bureaucracies being difficult to deal with, being impersonal, not caring about people. That comes from this creation of that closed system due to this theory, this cycle of institutional rigidity. But these organizations, through a natural systems perspective, are more concerned about what's going on within their organizations as opposed to what's going on outside the organization. But they also do recognize that what goes on outside the organization can impact them because it can rob them of energies, can rob them of their resources. This is somewhat similar to the very famous theory of John Gauss that I think we've covered in a previous class, known as the ecology of public administration. And the ecology of public administration says that to understand organizations and why they behave the way in which they behave, we need to look at them as, again, living organisms, very much a natural systems type of approach. So you think about an organization like a plant. That plant is reliant upon fertilizer, reliant upon water, reliant upon sunshine in order to explain how that organization will change and behave and grow. So we have to understand that what the organization does, like a living organism, is it processes all of these types of influences being placed upon it and does it to try and regulate its functions to enhance its survival. You can also think about it as being similar to the human body. So the goal here among natural systems theorists is for organizations to kind of create this balance whereby, like the human body, the blood pressure is normal, pulse ox levels are normal, the blood sugar levels are normal. The body is devoid of serious pulmonary diseases or cancer or any of these other diseases. And when the body is in that type of a state, it is more likely to survive longer than if it was not in that type of balance. So you think about if your individual is a heavy smoker as compared to an individual who does not smoke. The heavy smoker obviously has much higher chances of developing lung cancer and much higher chance of having a shorter lifespan than the organization that behaved differently in terms of smoking cigarettes. So again, this kind of living organism type of analogy really underpins this idea of natural systems theory. Then the other side of systems theory is open systems perspective. Open systems perspective shares some similarities to the natural perspective, and we'll talk about those in a minute. But the primary difference between open systems and natural systems is very simply the focus in open systems is more on the external environment as opposed to just looking at the internal processes within the organization itself. So much more of a focus on what's going on in the external environment and how the organization affects the external environment and how the organizational environment affects the organization. So it becomes very much of a two-way street in terms of studying the relationship between the organization and the environment in which that organization exists. So that's a primary difference between natural versus open systems theories. Some of the underlying assumptions that are similar between the two different approaches. Both natural and open systems theorists will assume that these systems that they're talking about, whether they're internal systems or external systems, that these systems lack a concrete existence. These systems are not permanent. These systems are very much dynamic in nature. There's an ebb and a flow to the health, if you will, of these systems. These systems can go away. These systems can disappear. The REA is our example. We saw that system that had been supporting the REA go away. It took, 60 years, almost 60 years for it to happen, but eventually it did happen. One of the examples that's most painful to me is the Advisory Commission on Intergovernmental Relations. That is another example of an organization that went out of existence. It was created in 1959, went out of existence in 1996. The reason why it went out of existence is it lost its appropriations from Congress. Congress zeroed out the ACIR. That's an example of this system that was around from 1959 to 1996 going out of existence. And it went out of existence very, very quickly. In 1994, they had funding. They had their line item appropriations from Congress. They were issuing contracts. I actually worked as a PI on one of the very last contracts that the ACIR had, looking at the impacts of federal laws on local governments. My role in the process was to look at the impact of laws like ADA and the fiscal and programmatic impacts of ADA on local school districts. And so I had one little sliver of this project. It ended up being the last project because Congress didn't like the results of that project. And so therefore they took their appropriations away. The system collapsed. ACIR went out of existence. So these systems are not permanent in nature. Both natural as well as open systems theorists believe that in studying organizations, we need to create these conceptual frameworks because what goes on inside organizations and the relationship between organizations and their external environment, those relationships are extremely complex and they're extremely nuanced. So to understand this very complex phenomena, we need to develop these conceptual frameworks, these concepts and these theories that we can then take and apply in a variety of different situations. So systems theorists, whether they're natural or open in nature, they are very much focused on a theoretical perspective. How can we create these concepts and these theoretical frameworks to help us understand these organizations and how they behave? And both natural as well as open system theorists really focus very much on the interdependence of the parts within this system. So it's a system. You've got all these parts that are interacting with each other. We have to understand how they're interacting, what behaviors they're exhibiting, and why they're interacting in the way in which they're interacting, because everything is dependent upon everything else in that system. So again, very much of a holistic type of an approach. Another similarity between natural and open systems theory will be their focus on this idea of creating an equilibrium, creating this balance. This equilibrium is a patterned relationship, either for the natural systems theorists within the organization or for open systems theorists, a patterned relationship between the organization and its external environment. All organizations tend toward trying to find this equilibrium, trying to find this balance, whether it's an internal balance or it's a balance between the organization and the external environment. This balance, this equilibrium, is what is known in the literature as a point of homeostasis. Homeostasis is essentially when there's a regulation of the internal processes of the organization that will allow the organization to adapt to its challenges and opportunities being presented to it by the external environment. So all organizations are trying to find this point of homeostasis, this steady state, this point of equilibrium, this balance point. And that's the goal of all organizations. It's just how they go about achieving that equilibrium will be different depending upon whether it's an internal or more of an external focus. So all organizations trend toward finding this point of homeostasis. So again, for natural systems theorists, that would be that point where the human body is, as we said, has a normal blood pressure, has normal, all these normal levels, devoid of diseases. That's the point of homeostasis. That is a healthy individual. Organizations also have organizational health. And so a healthy organization could be an organization where all the internal processes are working together, where everyone is working toward the same goal. We have goal congruence within our organization. People have high cohesion levels, high morale levels. That could be that point of homeostasis, that perfect balance within the organization. So now that we've looked at the difference as well as some of the similarities between natural and open systems theory, let's kind of take a look at the specifics of how natural systems theory works versus how open systems theory works. So the one author that we really focus on here with natural systems theory is Chester Barnard. And again, we had talked about Chester Barnard last week within the context of human relations school. Now we're going to talk about him within the context of natural systems school. So Chester Barnard, most famously known for his work, Functions of the Executive, as we know from last week, assumed that effective organizations really were predicated upon a cooperative system of relationships. That, as we know, effective leaders and managers are only effective if they can get the compliance and the acquiescence of their employees. So our organizations are these cooperative systems where two or more individuals or parts are cooperating together in order to achieve the goals, primarily the goals of the organization. The primary goal of the organization will obviously be agency survival. So everyone's working together in order to get this agency to survive in the future. In order to be effective, organizations need to do two different things. One thing is they need resources. So they need to learn how to locate and acquire these resources to try and replace the resources that they are losing. So they want to obtain surplus resources, more resources than they actually need. When you took the public budgeting course, you may have talked about this principle known as budget maximization and strategic misrepresentation. Very common strategies in budgeting whereby agencies will misrepresent their budgetary needs to try and maximize their appropriations. So they'll basically just ask for more money than they need. So they feel that they need 3% in order to provide their current level of services that they provided last year, next fiscal year. They may ask for 5 or 6. That's budget maximization. That's to obtain these surplus resources and kind of give them this buffer, this cushion. Strategic misrepresentation and budget maximization is wildly popular among federal agencies and departments. And almost every federal agency and department engages in strategic misrepresentation and budget maximization. However, what the literature shows us is the budgeting literature shows us that even though most agencies engage in this, the level to which they engage in this is marginal. It's incremental. So you're not going to have an agency that needs 3% and goes out there and asks for a 30% increase. It's going to be a much more incremental request. So they need 3%, they ask for 3.5%, or they ask for 4%. So it's a much more incremental problem, even though it is widespread throughout the entire federal bureaucracy. The second thing organizations need to do in order to be effective and to survive in the future is to obtain these contributions from the members of the organization. And this is exactly what we talked about last week with Chester Barnard, the whole idea of this transactional leadership type of an approach. You provide the incentives to your members then, based upon those incentives, will then provide contributions to the organization. As the organization seeks its equilibrium, its system equilibrium, to achieve this perfect balance, this fit between the organization's internal processes and characteristics and external environment, it realizes that in order to do that, it has to find this balance between the incentives that are provided, the rewards that are provided to employees, and the contributions that are then extracted from those employees. The problem is, if you have an imbalance between the incentives and how much employees value those incentives and how much you're expecting them to give to the organization in contribution, you're going to have dissatisfied employees. If they feel that they're giving more than what they are getting, then they're going to be dissatisfied. So organizations that are efficient, according to Chester Barnard, are those organizations where the contributions that the organization's getting from employees will exceed the net dissatisfaction of those employees. So if you're getting the contributions and the contributions exceed the dissatisfaction level of your employees, then you are doing an efficient job as an organization, achieving this compliance and achieving this acquiescence in this cooperative type of system. Effectiveness for an organization is defined as how well the organization's achieving its goals. And the primary goal of any organization is, as we've said multiple times already tonight, agency survival, to survive into the future, to be able to confront these challenges and go on in the future. As we had talked about last week, leaders and managers within these organizations also have these limitations upon their formal authority, and the primary limitation are these zones of indifference among our different employees. Each employee has their own zone of indifference. If a manager or leader violates that zone of indifference, they're not going to get the contributions that they need. If they don't get the contributions that they need, then you're not going to be effective in achieving your goal of survival. Also, you're not going to be efficient because you're going to have dissatisfied employees, and their dissatisfaction levels will exceed the amount of contributions that you're getting as an organization. So Chester Barnard is telling us that we need to have this compliance, this cooperative type of system within our organization to make our organization survive. We need to achieve this balance between contributions and incentives. This system of balance can be maintained through three different ways. One way you can create this system of balance is through having an effective system of communication. You can't know what people value in terms of incentives until you actually communicate with those individuals. You can't know what each individual employee's zone of indifference is until you've communicated with those individual employees. So you have to have this good system, open system of communication. You have to have the proper set of incentives and inducements in order to get people to join and buy into the organization's goals and then be able to extract those contributions from them. So again, you need to find the right set of incentives versus contributions. And then you have to have a very good, clear definition of the goals of the organization. If people do not understand what the goal of the organization is, chances are they're not going to provide the right set of contributions to help the organization achieve those goals. So according to Barnard, there are these three different roles or functions of executives within organizations. Create an effective system of communication, figure out the balance between incentives and contributions, and clearly define the goals of the organization so that all members of the organization know what goals they are working toward. And those are what I consider to be the roles or the functions of the executive in this kind of internal natural systems type of focus. Now, we're already familiar with some of the criticisms of Chester Barnard and natural systems theory in general. As we talked about last week, just like our other human relations theorists, the primary criticism is that they tended to accept as unquestioned this assumption of the hierarchical authority of the classical theorists. It was very much of a top-down type of situation, very much kind of in line with how Weber and Taylor viewed organizations. Granted, there was more communication. Granted, there was more recognition of the inherent differences between individual employees, but you were still doing this for the purpose of helping the organization achieve its goal of trying to survive into the future. When you kind of have that hierarchical type of situation, you're violating the assumptions of a democratic organization. So it becomes relatively anti-democratic in nature, and they really didn't provide a whole lot of justification for this amount of social control that they were maintaining and exerting over the employees within the organization. So we know that all is not roses and rainbows with Chester Barnard and natural systems theorists. Now, Tompkins tells us natural systems theorists like Chester Barnard, in terms of the models of organizational effectiveness, Tompkins shades in all four of those quadrants of that matrix. Rational goal model, the open systems model, the internal process model, and the human relations model. My argument here with Tompkins, and actually a previous edition of Tompkins, actually shaded these in different colors, in different, I would say, gradations of gray. And I think that they're not all equally important. Clearly, the internal process model is very important as a model of organizational effectiveness. Clearly, there's a rational goal model, and the rational goal is agency survival. So clearly, you have that going. Clearly, human relations model, because you are looking at these employees, recognizing that they are all different in terms of their zones of indifference. They're all different in the value that they place upon these incentives. And so you certainly have to understand that people are different. So there's a human relations approach. Open systems, I would shade in very, very lightly. There is a recognition that the balance within the organization can be affected by the outside environment, but there's not nearly as much of a focus on the external environment with Barnard and natural systems theory, as we will see in a minute with people like Katz and Kahn and open systems theorists. So that quadrant I would shade in a much lighter shade of gray than the other three models of effectiveness. Mechanism for coordination and control, very much direct supervision. We have a lot of supervision, and we also have standardization of values. And I would agree with both of those. In terms of our methods for motivating our employees, instrumental rewards. Clearly, we have rewards for performance built in there in terms of this set of incentives. Considerate leadership in that we are communicating with our employees to find out what they value and why. There's group acceptance here, just like we had talked about last week with the human relations theories, and goal congruence. The more you can get congruence between the goals of the individual and the ultimate goal of the organization, which is agency survival, the more likely you are to get your employees motivated, the more likely you are to get the contributions from those employees. So that taken as a whole is basically an overview of what we consider to be natural systems theory. Now, most of our public and nonprofit organizations are going to operate much more in an open type of system. And once we get into a more open type of system, we're talking about more relationships going on between the organization and members of that external environment. But there's a big difference there in terms of focus between natural and open systems theorists. So to kind of give us a bridge and give us a segue between the school of natural systems and the school of open systems theory, in between those two, we kind of have this gray area that gets filled in by another school known as the structural functional school. And the structural functional school is this school that's kind of in between natural systems and open systems. It helps push us away from the natural systems approach and more toward an open systems approach. Here we have people like Merton, Blau, Goldner, and Phillips Selznick. Those are kind of more of our structural functional types of theorists. The one of all those that I really like to place an emphasis on is Robert Merton. I think that Merton does a very nice job of challenging a lot of the assumptions of natural systems theory. And by challenging those assumptions, he then paves the way for us to move into more of an open systems type of approach. So Merton is best known for, within this school of structural functional theory, his theory of middle ranges, his middle range theory. The middle range theory is a middle range theory that kind of falls in between natural and open systems theory. Merton questioned the underlying assumption in natural systems theory of organizations as living organisms. He says we really can't look at them as living organisms for a variety of reasons. One reason why they're not akin to living organisms is that not every activity that organizations engage in will be important for their goal, their ultimate goal of survival. So organizations will do things that are kind of counterintuitive for the accomplishment of their goal or their goals, plural. So not every activity they engage in will be important for their goal. Likewise, not every activity that an organization engages in ensures their survival. Sometimes organizations will do things that actually will increase the likelihood that they will not survive into the future. I previously mentioned the Advisory Commission on Intergovernmental Relations. And when you get into the PPA 535 Intergovernmental Relations class, we will talk a lot more about what happened to the Advisory Commission. But the primary problem with the Advisory Commission is that this last study that I mentioned that they did, the results of that study showed that there were some federal laws that should be decentralized out of Congress and returned down to the state and the local government. So a decentralization devolution of those laws. Those findings were found within a draft report that was produced by the Advisory Commission. That draft report that was produced by the Advisory Commission was never officially approved by the commissioners. So, the way in which the commission worked is it has its commissioners. Those commissioners are in charge of approving all of the reports that are done by the Advisory Commission. The primary job of the Advisory Commission was to study the relationships between national, state, and local governments in order to provide recommendations for how those relationships could be improved. That was the primary job of the Advisory Commission. It truly was an advisory commission. Offers this advice to Congress, and then Congress can then decide whether to take that advice or not. So this last draft report that was prepared by ACIR was not approved by the commissioners, but it was leaked to Congress. When it got leaked to Congress, members of Congress were livid about the results of this draft report. They didn't want to give up responsibility and control over these very high-profile federal programs and policies. One example are some of the elements of the Americans with Disabilities Act. Some of those elements that were legislated by Congress were placing some very significant impacts upon local governments that didn't have the fiscal wherewithal to pay for those all at once. They wanted to incorporate those over time in their capital improvement plan, and a lot of that was not being allowed under the legislation from Congress. So one of the recommendations is, not to get rid of the ADA. The ADA is a very valuable piece of legislation, but to allow more flexibility for state and local governments and to turn over some of the responsibility for overseeing some of these elements of the ADA to state and local governments. Well, we know members of Congress have one primary goal, and that primary goal, as David Mayhew told us, is that their primary goal is to get reelected. So one of the best ways you can get reelected as a member of Congress is to claim credit for legislation that you sponsored or co-sponsored. Well, if you're turning these bits of this legislation over to state and local governments, you no longer, as a member of Congress, have the ability to claim credit for it as a success. So Congress didn't like this. And basically what the draft report did is it pointed out problems with how Congress had passed this legislation. So Congress, livid at this draft report, decided, well, in fiscal year 1996, we're going to zero out the organization. We're going to take their money away. Now, did the ACAR know when this draft report was prepared that Congress would look very negatively upon it? Sure. I think everyone knew that. But they did it anyway, because that's where the research led them. And so that's an example of engaging in an activity that certainly did not ensure your survival. And in fact, it really expedited this organization going out of existence. Once your appropriations are zeroed out, you no longer have the money to pay for these contracts with these PIs. You no longer have the money to pay for your staff. You don't have the money to pay for the lease in your office building. So you shutter your operations and you go out of business. Also, Merton argues that not every activity an organization engages in is indispensable for that organization. There are activities that organizations engage in that are superfluous. We see a lot of superfluous spending, especially at the federal level. So not everything they do is indispensable for the organization. So what Merton tells us is instead of focusing on organizations and their survival, instead we should focus on the consequences of what these organizations are doing for their beneficiaries. So we ask the question, how are these programs and how are these services that are being produced and provided by this organization, how are these goods and services and programs benefiting the people who are supposed to benefit from them, the actual consumers, the beneficiaries of these programs? That is a very significant shift. Once you shift your focus away from organization survival and onto the consequences of what organizations are doing, you have now started to shift your focus into the external environment, because a lot of these beneficiaries are going to be external to the organization. So that shift is what really starts to move us away from the natural systems approach and more toward an open systems approach to how we study our organizations. This is what's known as Merton's functional theory. His functional theory says that public policies and public programs will remain in place as long as the net consequences of those programs and policies remain positive for beneficiaries. So as long as beneficiaries are getting net consequences that are positive, that the benefits of these programs and policies are exceeding their costs in terms of taxpayer money, in terms of inconvenience, as long as the net consequences are positive, that explains why these organizations will continue to engage in delivering these programs and these policies. So we focus on the beneficiaries of the policies. This functional theory is something that was very much embraced by Osborne and Gabler in their reinvention of government that they published in the 1980s, that was then adopted by the Clinton-Gore administration in the 1990s with their reinvention of government movement. And so this really takes hold, if you will, at the federal level in the Clinton-Gore administration. Now we're just not considering people that they're citizens, but we're looking at them as consumers. We're asking them, how is this federal organization meeting your wants, needs, and desires? What are the true tangible benefits you are getting out of all these programs and these goods and services that you are receiving from these federal agencies? That's when we get the Government Performance Results Act. That's when we get these scorecards that agencies then have to start filling out on an annual basis to submit to OMB to show how they're meeting the needs of quote unquote consumers. The problem, Merton says in his functional theory, is organizations, as they have aged and as they have kind of gone down this path of institutional rigidity that we talked about before, they really start to create this closed type of system. And this closed type of system means that they are starting to displace their goals. instead of focusing on the goal of how are we serving our consumers, the goal becomes how are we adhering to our rules and regulations. So as organizations age, they become more closed off, they become more institutionally rigid, they start to create more rules and regulations and procedures. And then the ultimate goal of the organization is to abide by those rules and those procedures, as opposed to the ultimate goal being trying to meet the needs of our beneficiaries. So this is what he calls one of the primary bureaucratic dysfunctions of any bureaucratic organization: overconformity. Overconformity with rules and regulations and procedures. When you start focusing more on rules and regulations as opposed to meeting the needs of your beneficiaries, once you start becoming more institutionally rigid and setting up these walls between the organization and the beneficiaries, that's when you start to create all this conflict between the bureaucrats and members of the public. This is what has led to all those negative perceptions of the bureaucracy that Charles Goodsell told us about back in his book in the 1970s, The Case for the Bureaucracy. This is one of the reasons why people always attach very negative associations with the term bureaucracy and bureaucratic organization. So Merton is important because what Merton has done is he has started to move us more toward an open systems approach. Merton, Blau, Goldner, and some other of our structural functional theorists, in terms of their models of organizational effectiveness, I think you see a little bit of all of the four models. You certainly see a rational goal type of approach in that the goal has now changed. It's not just trying to adhere to rules and regulations and making the organization survive in the future. Now the goal should be serving our beneficiaries. Since our goal has become serving our beneficiaries who are located outside the organization, you definitely have more of an open systems type of approach with structural functional theory. There's a human relations approach, obviously, as well, because these are the individuals who are creating the goods and the services that will meet the needs of their beneficiaries. If we're not meeting the needs of beneficiaries, we have to go back and see why. We have to look within the organization and see how people are doing their jobs. We also have to look at the internal processes of the organization. If we can rectify those internal processes, rectify some of our human relations issues, that will help us meet our ultimate goal of meeting the wants, needs, and desires of our beneficiaries. Given that, it's not surprising that the reinvention of government in the Clinton-Gore administration led to a downsizing of the federal government of anywhere from about 350,000 to 400,000 federal employees. And again, it really depends upon how you are counting the number of positions that were eliminated. A lot of those positions were eliminated within the Department of Defense. Some of those positions were active duty military. So oftentimes active duty military, we sometimes don't include within federal bureaucracy because they're not within the traditional general schedule of the federal bureaucracy. So it kind of depends upon how you count the beans. But anywhere from 350,000 to 400,000 employees were removed from the federal bureaucracy. Their positions were eliminated, again, to try and make the federal bureaucracy more efficient and more effective in the way in which it's delivering services to beneficiaries. So since we're looking at beneficiaries and we're turning our attention outside of the organization, that is what then speeds our progress toward open systems theory. So again, natural systems theory, very internal focus. Open systems theory, much more of an external focus. Open systems theorists really looked at the adaptation of the organization to the challenges in its environment as being a much more aggressive type of process. That it's not just that what happens in the environment affects the organization, but what the organization does and how it adapts to those changes in the environment can also then have an impact upon the environment as well. So it becomes this two-way street. Not just how does the environment affect the organization, how can the organization be aggressive in affecting its environment? Now, one of the hopes of the reinvention of government, obviously, was to make people more satisfied with the federal bureaucracy. It wasn't really, the problem wasn't really the bureaucrats. It wasn't the people. The problem was more the system itself in the federal government. Now, you think about the more recent attempts and strategies of something like Elon Musk and Doge. I think in that downsizing, I think that the focus was much more on individual bureaucrats. Individual bureaucrats not performing well, not doing their jobs, a lot of fraud and waste and abuse among those federal bureaucrats. Those were the reasonings on which this downsizing, recent downsizing in 2025, the reason why it was predicated upon. So it's a little bit different, I think, than the downsizing we saw at the reinvention of government back in the 1990s. So we're looking at this more external focus, looking at the behaviors of the organization to try and affect its environment. Again, for the purpose of helping the organization grow and help the organization thrive. Now, our natural systems theorists made the argument that as organizations age, they dissipate energy and resources into the environment. They undergo this scientific process of entropy, and all living organisms go through that process. Open systems theorists such as Katz and Kahn would make the argument that not always the case. That yes, organizations can lose energy and resources to the environment, but they can also import new energy and resources to replace those energies and resources that were lost. So organizations do not always deteriorate and go out of existence. There's not this lifespan of an organization because organizations that are effective are able to import new energy and import new resources into their organizations. You think about an organization like the State Department. The State Department was first created in 1789 at the founding of the nation. The State Department is still alive and well today. In fact, the State Department has now started to assume the functions of other agencies that have been downsized through the DOGE types of efforts. So you think about something like USAID. USAID basically was shuttered up. They actually took the name USAID off of the building, and they're going to house most of what USAID is left of USAID inside the Department of State, more fully within the Department of State. And so you're seeing the Department of State actually grow, if not in size, at least grow in terms of its functions and its responsibilities. And it's an organization that is almost 250 years old. So organizations don't always go through entropy and die. They have this process of negative entropy where they can actually import new resources into their organization and can actually grow instead of going out of existence. The ultimate goal with open systems theory, similar to natural systems theory, is to find this point of balance, this point of homeostasis. For open systems theorists, obviously the balance is between the organization and its external environment. That's their homeostasis, their balance point. There are multiple different ways that organizations can find this homeostasis, this balance between themselves and their external environment. The idea that there are a number of different paths to get to that final steady state of homeostasis is a term that's known as equifinality. Equifinality is important to us because if we believe equifinality, that there are a number of different ways that organizations can achieve their point of homeostasis, then we also have to assume that these relationships between the organization and its external environment are very complex relationships, which means that it's a much more difficult way for us to study our organizations. So we're going to have to take a much more nuanced, much more complex approach to studying how organizations achieve this point of homeostasis. So it suggests for us more of the contextual, it depends type of approach to understanding how organizations find this proper balance between the organization and its external environment. Again, Katz and Kahn are your two primary theorists that are most notable within this world of open systems theory, really looking at focusing on the environmental forces that will help shape organizations. We saw a great example of these environmental forces just today. If you were keeping up on the news, the governor's office released the May revise, just came out today, and this is what we're all eagerly anticipating because that May revise will then change the governor's priorities from back in his budget in January and will then really create the framework in which the state legislature must work on that budget and get that budget passed no later than June 15th. As you know from your budgeting class, here in California, the budget needs to be passed by the legislature by June 15th. then signed by the governor by June 30th for the beginning of the new fiscal year on July 1st. Now, oftentimes there are trailer bills that are going to be passed throughout July and August that will really fill in all the blanks in terms of how this money is to be spent. But the May revise really does restructure a lot of our discussion over the state budget. The May revise that came out today, at least for the Cal State system, was actually very positive. And I think I'm shocked by it. And I think a lot of people in the Cal State system are shocked by it as well. In the governor's original budget, the cut to the Cal State system was in the range of about 8%. That is a massive budget cut for educational institutions. When I was teaching in Florida, my university in Florida, the state of Florida was going through some very bad economic times. It was 2000, 2001. The property market, the housing market was actually collapsing in Florida at that point in time. We had just had a major hurricane a few years before. People couldn't get insurance, and it was a very bad situation for the Florida economy. We actually ended up getting a 10% cut to our university. All state universities in Florida got a 10% cut, and it almost killed the university, a 10% cut. 8% cut is a pretty big cut. We have some Cal States that were worried about actually going out of existence. That 8% cut has now been reduced to, I believe it's a 2.8% cut. That is a huge reduction in the loss of funds for the Cal State system. So that type of environmental force is certainly going to have a big impact upon all the Cal State campuses and what they do and how they do it. There's a lot of talk here at Long Beach about the fact that there would be money for travel and all this money. There would be money to hire staff members. That was all predicated upon the assumption of an 8% cut. A 2.8% cut is much more palatable, I think, to all the campuses in the Cal State system. So we understand how those environmental forces affect our organization and what our organization can do to try and affect the environment as well. There was a letter writing campaign. There was a lot of lobbying that was being done by the Cal State system, as well as by the Faculty Association to try and get this 8% cut reduced. And it looks like a lot of that worked. And so there is this two-way street. In terms of our open systems theorists and what our open systems theorists say about the models of organizational effectiveness, clearly there's a lot of a focus placed upon the open systems approach, and that's just kind of commonsensical. In terms of our mechanisms of coordination and control, I would say here is where we really start getting this idea of it depends, the contextual nature. The way in which we control our organizations will depend upon the influences that we're facing from the external environment and how our organization wants to try and influence its external environment in turn. So you see that Tompkins hasn't shaded in any of those mechanisms of coordination control because it really does depend upon the situation. Similar type of deal with our motivational strategies. We don't shade any of those in because the motivational strategy will depend upon the situation in which we find ourselves and the environment in which we find ourselves at that current point in time. Again, it's a very dynamic type of existence for these systems, so it really does depend upon the period of time and the influences that we're facing at that period. Out of the open systems approach, we then have the development of a couple of different schools that kind of rose out of the open systems holistic approach to understanding organizations. One of those schools that grew out of it is the socio-technical school from people like Emery and Trist. The socio-technical school tells us we can understand our organization better by recognizing from a more holistic perspective that what organizations do is a combination of the technical and the social. So if we only take a Weberian Taylor-esque type of approach to looking at the structure of the organization, the processes in the organization, we are going to get an incomplete picture. However, if we only take a Mayo approach, a human relations approach, and we only look at the social elements and we ignore the technical elements, then we're also going to get an incomplete picture. What the socio-technical authors tell us is to best understand our organizations, we need to take a joint optimization approach. And joint optimization tells us that organizational effectiveness is explained by a combination both the technical processes within the organization as well as the social dynamics and the social environment within the organization as well. Again, a much more holistic, much more contextual approach to understanding our organizations. Another school that kind of grew out of our discussion of open systems theory is a school that I'm a big fan of, and that's the structural contingency school from authors such as Burns and Stalker. So the structural contingency school tells us that our primary job is to try and understand our organizations, to understand why they're organized the way in which they are, why they do the types of things they do. That is essentially our dependent variable in very much of a social science research type of perspective. The changes in our environment in which we operate are then our independent variables. So how can we take the combination of our independent variables to explain the variation in our dependent variable? So how can we understand all these changes in the external environment and what those changes in the external environment mean for how we've structured the organization and how the organization operates on a daily basis? So structural contingency theorists will really take into account the whole it depends approach that I am such a fan of. Why are organizations, why do they look the way they do? Why do they behave in which they do? It depends. It depends upon a variety of different elements in the environment. One element that will impact our organizations is environmental uncertainty. So how much certainty is there in the environment? How stable is the environment versus how unstable the environment is? I think you can argue for a lot of federal agencies since January with all the cuts from DOGE and all the downsizing that there's a lot of environmental uncertainty. In the wake of September 11th, there was a lot of environmental uncertainty. In the wake of the housing crisis in 2008 and 2009, there was a lot of environmental uncertainty. In the wake of the Great Depression, there's a lot of environmental uncertainty. So the more environmental uncertainty will have an impact, obviously, on what the organization does. Organizations, when they face environmental uncertainty, they oftentimes are more risk adverse. They're not going to be as creative and innovative. They're not going to try as many new things as they might do in a very stable type of environment. Another element that can affect organizations, the technology within the organization, as well as technological challenge from outside. Think of things like cybersecurity threats and how that can affect what organizations do and how they structure themselves. A lot of cybersecurity threats will probably mean that you will reorient your decision making, the way in which you make your decisions. You're probably not going to use open access apps in order to discuss these types of things. You're going to be careful sometimes in terms of the type of information that's transmitted electronically and want to have those firewalls and those protections in place. The size of the organization relative to its environment will also have an impact upon the organization. If you're a very small organization and you're a small fish in an ocean, then you're going to have less ability to probably influence your environment, and you're going to be more subject to environmental influences. So size will have an impact. If you're a small organization, you're probably going to be able to be more nimble and be more reactive and decentralize decision making a lot more than if you are a larger organization. Strategy will have an impact upon the organization as well. Hopefully, all organizations are engaging in strategic planning. Hopefully, all organizations are going out there and completing their SWOT analyses, their strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, or if you prefer SWOT, and if you don't like threats, you can use challenges. But hopefully they're going out there and doing their SWOT or their SWOT analysis as part of their strategic planning process. And then hopefully this strategic planning process will then have an impact upon how the organization is structured and how the organization then behaves. Resource dependency. How dependent is the organization on resources from the external environment? If you are completely dependent upon appropriations, then the relationships you are going to want to build will be relationships with elected officials, those budget makers. If you are more reliant upon grants and donations, then you're going to have to build those relationships with your donors. If you are very dependent upon one source of revenue, that's going to leave you vulnerable to challenges in the future. We saw this with local governments here in the state of California. And again, to harken back to your budgeting class, you learned all about Proposition 13, and you know that Proposition 13 limited the amount of revenue that local governments can generate from the property tax through the rate limitation and the assessment limitation. When that happened, it meant that local governments had been very heavily reliant upon the property tax. Once the state stopped backfilling their loss of property tax in 1981, if they didn't go out there and diversify their revenue portfolio by then, they were going to be in a whole lot of trouble because they just could not raise that property tax revenue anymore. So John Mikesell, a very famous budgeting scholar who I typically use his book when I teach budgeting, tells us that in order for organizations to be effective and to weather fiscal challenges, they need to have diversity in their revenue portfolio. So resource dependency will have an impact upon the organization, how it looks, and what it does. And the level of public scrutiny and public accountability. Some organizations are held to much higher standards of public accountability than other organizations. Those organizations that are very open to public scrutiny, their behaviors and their processes and their structures are going to look a lot different than organizations that are not quite that subject to that type of scrutiny. So some organizations, depending upon their functions, depending upon the type of information that they manage, if it's confidential information, especially at the federal level, if it's classified or compartmentalized information, there's a lot less public scrutiny than if you are, from my experience, a local school district. As a local school district, most everything is out there with the exception of student records and disciplinary records and personnel records. Beyond that, most things are going to be out there in the public domain. And so the more public accountability you are held to, the more scrutiny you have, that will then have an impact upon how you structure your organization and then how you go about your daily business. So I think the structural contingency approach is a great approach because it does really emphasize this whole "it depends" idea. Whenever we are saying how we study our organizations depends upon the context of the situation, we are by definition saying studying those organizations will inherently be more difficult than if we would merely rely upon a one-size-fits-all approach like we could do with our classical theorists such as Weber and Taylor. So it really is very much this "it depends" type of approach. As I mentioned before, for both open systems and structural contingency, it's an open systems model of organizational effectiveness. For the mechanisms of coordination control, the motivational strategies, it really does depend. It really does depend upon the context of the situation. So that's kind of our coverage here in the first half of class on systems theory, natural versus open systems theory, our coverage of a couple of schools that kind of grew out of open systems theory, socio-technical theory, and structural contingency theories. Again, much more of an "it depends" type of a contextual approach to studying our organizations. At this point, do you have any questions over the information we have covered over the past, I guess, 75 minutes at this point? Any questions or observations on any of this information? Well, I know I have been talking for quite a while now, and so you need a break from the monotony of my voice. I think I need a break from the monotony of my voice as well. So it's 7:15, so let's go ahead and take a 15-minute break. And when we come back at 7:30, I do have a breakout room exercise that we are going to do. I'll give you a little preface to it when we come back from break, and we'll talk a little bit about SWOT analysis. If you haven't engaged in that before in your workplace or been exposed to it much here in the MPA program, we'll talk a bit more about SWOT analysis and how it's done and some of the advantages and some of the pitfalls involved in it. And then we'll go through this group assignment where we will look at some of the primary challenges and opportunities that our organizations tend to face from their external environments. So take a break, come on back at 7:30, and we'll do our breakout rooms.